Welcome to the Voxlore. Our channel produces immersive fantasy audiobooks for entertainment and storytelling enjoyment. All content, including narration, sound design, and storytelling elements, is created with passion for fantasy fans. Chapter 21 The Colonel is warned. It is difficult to refrain from mention of the leave-taking of Miss Virginia Carvel from the Monticello Female Seminary, so called in the Democrat. Most young ladies did not graduate in those days. There were exercises. Stephen chanced to read in the Republican about these ceremonies, which mentioned that Miss Virginia Carvel, daughter of Colonel Comyn Carvel, was without doubt the beauty of the day. She wore, but why destroy the picture? I have the costumes under my hand. The words are meaningless to all males, and young women might laugh at a critical time. Miss Emily Russell performed upon that most superb of all musical instruments, the human voice. Was it Auld Robin Gray that she sang? I am sure it was Miss Maud Catherwood who recited "To My Mother" with such effect. Miss Carvel, so Stephen learned with alarm, was to read a poem by Mrs. Browning, but was unavoidably prevented. The truth was, as he heard afterward from Miss Puss Russell, that Miss Ginny had refused point blank. So the lady principal, to save her reputation for discipline, had been forced to deceive the press. There was another who read the account of the exercises with intense interest, a gentleman of whom we have lately forborne to speak. This is Mr. Eliphalet Hopper. Eliphalet has prospered. It is to be doubted if that somewhat easygoing gentleman, Colonel Carvel, realized the full importance of Eliphalet to Carvel and Company. Mr. Hood had been superseded. Ephraim still opened the store in the mornings, but Mr. Hopper was within the ground-glass office before the place was warm, and through warerooms and shipping rooms rubbing his hands to see if any were late. Many of the old force were missed, and a new and greater force were come in. These feared Eliphalet as they did the devil, and worked the harder to please him because Eliphalet had hired that kind. To them the colonel was lifted high above the sordid affairs of the world. He was at the store every day in the winter, and Mr. Hopper always followed him obsequiously into the ground-glass office, called in the bookkeeper, and showed him the books and the increased earnings. The colonel thought of Mr. Hood and his slovenly management, and sighed in spite of his doubled income. Mr. Hopper had added to the company's list of customers whole districts in the growing Southwest, and yet the honest colonel did not like him. Mr. Hopper, by a gradual process, had taken upon his own shoulders, and consequently off the colonel's, responsibility after responsibility. There were some painful scenes, of course, such as the departure of Mr. Hood, which never would have occurred had not Eliphalet proved without question the incapacity of the ancient manager. Mr. Hopper only narrowed his lids when the colonel pensioned Mr. Hood. But the colonel had a will before which, when roused, even Mr. Hopper trembled. So that Eliphalet was always polite to Ephraim, and careful never to say anything in the darkey's presence against incompetent clerks or favorite customers, who, by the charity of the colonel, remained on his books. One spring day, after the sober homecoming of Colonel Carvel from the Democratic Convention at Charleston, Ephraim accosted his master as he came into the store of a morning. Ephraim's face was working with excitement. "What's the matter with you, Ephraim?" asked the colonel kindly. "You haven't been yourself lately." "No, Marsa, I ain't exactly." Ephraim put down the duster, peered out of the door of the private office and closed it softly. "Mas Comyn?" "Yes." "Mas Comyn, I ain't got no use for dat Mistay Hoppa, Sie kinder substitious, 'bout him, Marsa." The colonel put down his newspaper. "Has he treated you badly, Ephraim?" he asked quietly. The faithful Negro saw another question in his master's face. He well knew that Colonel Carvel would not descend to ask an inferior concerning the conduct of a superior. "Oh no, Sue. And I ain't sayin' nothin' gin his honesty. He straight but he powerful sharp, Mas Comyn. And he just muciless down to assent." The colonel sighed. He realized that which was beyond the grasp of the Negro's mind. New and thriftier methods of trade from New England were fast replacing the old open-handedness of the large houses. Competition had begun, and competition is cruel. Edwards, James and Company had taken a Yankee into the firm. They were now Edwards, James and Doddington, and Mr. Edwards's coolness towards the colonel was manifest since the rise of Eliphalet. They were rivals now instead of friends. But Colonel Carvel did not know until after years that Mr. Hopper had been offered the place which Mr. Doddington filled later. As for Mr. Hopper, increase of salary had not changed him. He still lived in the same humble way in a single room in Miss Crane's boarding house, and he paid very little more for his board than he had that first week in which he swept out Colonel Carvel's store. He was superintendent now of Mr. DeWitt's Sunday school and a church officer. At night, when he came home from business, he would read the widow's evening paper, and the colonel's morning paper at the office. Of true Puritan abstemiousness, his only indulgence was chewing tobacco. It was as early as 1859 that the teller of the Boatman's Bank began to point out Mr. Hopper's back to casual customers, and he was more than once seen to enter the president's room, which had carpet on the floor. Eliphalet's suavity with certain delinquent customers from the Southwest was a wording to Scripture. When they were profane and invited him into the street, he reminded them that the city had a police force and a jail. While still a young man, he had a manner of folding his hands and smiling which is peculiar to capitalists, and he knew the laws concerning mortgages in several different states. But Eliphalet was content still to remain in the sphere in which Providence had placed him, and so to be an example for many of us. He did not buy or even hire an evening suit. He was pleased to superintend some of the details for a dance at Christmas time before Virginia left Monticello, but he sat as usual on the stair landing. There Mr. Jacob Clum, who had been that day in conversation with the teller of the Boatman's Bank, chanced upon him. Mr. Clum was so charmed at the facility with which Eliphalet recounted the rise and fall of sugar and cotton and wheat that he invited Mr. Hopper to dinner. And from this meal may be reckoned the first appearance of the family of which Eliphalet Hopper was the head into polite society. If the Clum household was not polite, it was nothing. Eliphalet sat next to Miss Bell, and heard the private history of many old families, which he cherished for future use. Mrs. Clum apologized for the dinner, which, if the truth were told, needed an apology. All of which is significant, but sordid and uninteresting. Jacob Clum usually bought stocks before a rise. There was only one person who really bothered Eliphalet as he rose into prominence, and that person was Captain Elijah Brent. If, upon entering the ground-glass office, he found Eliphalet without the colonel, Captain Legay would walk out again just as if the office were empty. The inquiries he made were addressed always to Ephraim. Once, when Mr. Hopper had bidden him good morning and pushed a chair toward him, the honest captain had turned his back and marched straight to the house or 10th Street, where he found the colonel alone at breakfast. The captain sat down opposite. "Colonel," said he without an introduction, "I don't like this here business of letting Hopper run your store. He's a fish, I tell you." The colonel drank his coffee in silence. "Legay," he said gently, "he's nearly doubled my income. It isn't the old times when we all went our own way and kept our old customers year in and year out. You know that." The captain took a deep draught of the coffee which Jackson had laid before him. "Colonel Carvel," he said emphatically, "the fellow's a damned rascal, and will ruin you yet if you don't take advice." The colonel shifted uneasily. "The books show that he's honest, Legay." "Yes," cried Legay with his fist on the table. "Honest to a mill. But if that fellow ever gets on top of you or anyone else, he'll grind you into dust." "He isn't likely to get on top of me, Legay. I know the business and keep watch. And now that Ginny's coming home from Monticello, I feel that I can pay more attention to her, kind of take her mother's place," said the colonel, putting on his felt hat and tipping his chair. "Legay, I want that girl to have every advantage. She ought to go to Europe and see the world. That trip east last summer did her a heap of good. When we were at Calvert House, Dan read her something that my grandfather had written about London, and she was regularly fired. First I must take her to the Eastern Shore to see Carvel Hall. Dan still owns it. Now it's London and Paris." The captain walked over to the window and said nothing. He did not see the searching gray eyes of his old friend upon him. "Legay," said the colonel. The captain turned. "Legay, why don't you give up steamboating and come along to Europe? You're not 40 yet, and you have a heap of money laid by." The captain shook his head with the vigor that characterized him. "This ain't no time for me to leave," he said. "Colonel, I tell you there's a storm comin'. The colonel pulled his goatee uneasily. Here at last was a man in whom there was no guile. "Legay," he said, "isn't it about time you got married?" Upon which the captain shook his head again, even with more vigor. He could not trust himself to speak. After the Christmas holidays he had driven Virginia across the frozen river, all the way to Monticello in a sleigh. It was night when they had reached the school, the light of its many windows casting long streaks on the snow under the trees. He had helped her out and had taken her hand as she stood on the step. "Be good, Ginny," he had said. "Remember what a short time it will be until June. And your pa will come over to see you." She had seized him by the buttons of his great coat and said tearfully, "Oh, Captain Legay, I shall be so lonely when you are away. Aren't you going to kiss me?" He had put his lips to her forehead, driven madly back to Alton, and spent the night. The first thing he did the next day when he reached St. Louis was to go straight to the colonel and tell him bluntly of the circumstance. "Legay, I'd hate to give her up," Mr. Carvel said, but I'd rather you'd marry her than any man I can think of. Chapter 22. Signs of the Times. In that spring of 1860 the time was come for the South to make her final stand. And as the noise of gathering conventions shook the ground, Stephen Brice was not the only one who thought of the question at Freeport. The hour was now at hand for it to bear fruit. Meanwhile, his hero, the hewer of rails and forger of homely speech, Abraham Lincoln, had made a little tour eastward the year before, and had startled Cooper Union with a new logic and a new eloquence. They were the same logic and the same eloquence which had startled Stephen. Even as he predicted who had given it birth, the question destroyed the great Democratic Party. Colonel Carvel traveled to the convention in historic Charleston soberly and fearing God, as many another Southern gentleman. In old St. Michael's they knelt to pray for harmony, for peace, for a front bold and undismayed toward those who wronged them. All through the week chosen orators wrestled in vain. Judge Douglas, you flattered yourself that you had evaded the question. Do you see the Southern delegates rising in their seats? Alabama leaves the hall, followed by her sister Stakes. The South has not forgotten your Freeport heresy. Once she loved you, now she will have none of you. Gloomily indeed did Colonel Carvel return home. He loved the Union and the flag for which his grandfather Richard had fought so bravely. That flag was his inheritance. So the judge, laying his hand upon the knee of his friend, reminded him gravely. But the colonel shook his head. The very calmness of their argument had been portentous. No, Whipple, said he. You are a straightforward man. You can't disguise it. You of the North are bent upon taking away from us the rights we had when our fathers framed the Constitution. However the nigger got to this country, sir, in your Bristol and Newport traders as well as in our Virginia and Maryland ships, he is here and he was here when the Constitution was written. He is happier in slavery than are your factory hands in New England, and he is no more fit to exercise the solemn rights of citizenship, I say, than the half-breeds in the South American states. The judge attempted to interrupt, but Mr. Carvel stopped him. Suppose you deprive me of my few slaves, you do not ruin me. Yet you do me as great a wrong as you do my friend Samuels of Louisiana, who depends on the labor of 500. Shall I stand by selfishly and see him ruined, and thousands of others like him? Profoundly depressed, Colonel Carvel did not attend the adjourned convention at Baltimore, which split once more on Mason and Dixon's line. The Democrats of the young Northwest stood for Douglas and Johnson, and the solid South in another hall, nominated Breckinridge and Lane. This, of course, became the colonel's ticket. What a babel of voices was raised that summer, each with its cure for existing ills. Between the extremes of the black Republican Negro worshippers and the Southern Rights Party of Breckinridge, your conservative had the choice of two candidates, of Judge Douglas or Senator Bell. A most respectable but practically extinct body of gentlemen in ruffled shirts, the old line Whigs, had likewise met in Baltimore. A new name being necessary, they called themselves Constitutional Unionists. Senator Bell was their candidate, and they proposed to give the nation soothing syrup. So said Judge Whipple with a grunt of contempt to Mr. Clume, who was then a prominent Constitutional Unionist. Other and most estimable gentlemen were also Constitutional Unionists, notably Mr. Calvin Brinsmade. Far be it from anyone to cast disrespect upon the reputable members of this party, whose broad wings sheltered likewise so many weak brethren. One Sunday evening in May the judge was taking tea with Mrs. Brice. The occasion was memorable for more than one event, which was that he addressed Stephen by his first name for the first time. You're an admirer of Abraham Lincoln, he had said. Stephen, used to Mr. Whipple's ways, smiled quietly at his mother. He had never dared mention to the judge his suspicions concerning his journey to Springfield and Freeport. Stephen, said the judge, here the surprise came in, Stephen, what do you think of Mr. Lincoln's chances for the Republican nomination? We hear of no name but Seward's, sir, said Stephen when he had recovered. The judge grunted. Do you think that Lincoln would make a good president? He added. I have thought so, sir, ever since you were good enough to give me the opportunity of knowing him. It was a bold speech. The judge drew his great eyebrows together, but he spoke to Mrs. Brice. I'm not as strong as I was once, ma'am, said he. And yet I am going to that Chicago convention. Mrs. Brice remonstrated mildly, to the effect that he had done his share of political work. He scarcely waited for her to finish. I shall take a younger man with me in case anything happens. In fact, ma'am, I had thought of taking your son if you can spare him. And so it was that Stephen went to that most dramatic of political gatherings, in the historic wigwam. It was so that his eyes were opened to the view of the monster which maims the vitality of the republic, the political machine. Mr. Seward had brought his machine from New York. A legion prepared to fill the wigwam with their bodies, and to drown with their cries all names save that of their master. Stephen indeed had his eyes opened. Through the kindness of Judge Whipple, he heard many quiet talks between that gentleman and delegates from other states, Pennsylvania and Illinois and Indiana and elsewhere. He perceived that the judge was no nonentity in this new party. Mr. Whipple sat in his own room, and the delegates came and ranged themselves along the bed. Late one night, when the delegates were gone, Stephen ventured to speak what was in his mind. "Mr. Lincoln did not strike me as the kind of man, sir, who would permit a bargain." "Mr. Lincoln's at home playing barn ball," said the judge curtly. "He doesn't expect the nomination." "Then," said Stephen rather hotly, "I think you are unfair to him. You are expecting the judge to thunder." Sometimes he liked this kind of speech. "Stephen, I hope that politics may be a little cleaner when you become a delegate," he answered with just the suspicion of a smile. "Supposing you are convinced that Abraham Lincoln is the only man who can save the Union, and supposing that the one way to get him nominated is to meet Seward's gang with their own methods, what would you do, sir?" "I want a practical proposition, sir," said Mr. Whipple, "one that we can use tonight. It is now 1 o'clock. As Stephen was silent, the judge advised him to go to bed. And the next morning, while Mr. Seward's henchmen, confident and uproarious, were parading the streets of Chicago with their bands and their bunting, the vast wigwam was quietly filling up with bony Westerners whose ally was none other than the state of Pennsylvania. These gentlemen possessed wind which they had not wasted in processions. And the Lord delivered Seward and all that was his into their hands. How the light of Mr. Seward's hope went out after the first ballot, and how some of the gentlemen attached to his person wept, and how the voices shook the wigwam, and the thunder of the guns rolled over the tossing water of the lake, many now living remember. That day a name was delivered to the world through the mouths political schemers which was destined to enter history, that of the savior of the nation. Down in Little Springfield, on a vacant lot near the station, a tall man in his shirt sleeves was playing barn ball with some boys. The game finished, he had put on his black coat and was starting homeward under the tree, when a fleet youngster darted after him with a telegram. The tall man read it and continued on his walk, his head bent and his feet taking long strides. Later in the day he was met by a friend. "Abe," said the friend, "I'm almighty glad there's somebody in this town's got notorious at last." In the early morning of their return from Chicago, Judge Whipple and Stephen were standing in the front of a ferry boat crossing the Mississippi. The sun was behind them. The judge had taken off his hat, and his gray hair was stirred by the river breeze. Illness had set a yellow seal on the face, but the younger man remarked it not. For Stephen, staring at the black blur of the city outline, was filled with a strange exultation which might have belonged to his Puritan forefathers. Now at length was come his chance to be of use in life, to dedicate the labor of his hands and of his brains to Abraham Lincoln, uncouth prophet of the West. With all his might he would work to save the city for the man who was the hope of the Union. The bell rang. The great paddles scattered the brow waters with white foam, and the judge voiced his thoughts. "Stephen," said he, "I guess we'll have to put on shoulders to the wheel this summer. If Lincoln is not elected, I have lived my 65 years for nothing." As he descended the plank, he laid a hand on Stephen's arm and tottered. The big Louisiana, Captain Brent's boat, just in from New Orleans, was blowing off her steam as with slow steps they climbed the levee and the steep pitch of the street beyond it. The clatter of hooves and the crack of whips reached their ears, and like many others before them and since, they stepped into Carvel and Company's. On the inside of the glass partition of the private office, a voice of great suavity was heard. It was Eliphalet Hopper's. "If you will give me the numbers of the bales, Captain Brent, I'll send a dray down to your boat and get them." It was a very decisive voice that answered. "No, sir, I prefer to do business with my friend, Colonel Carvel. I guess I can wait. I could sell the goods to Texas buyers who are here in the store right now. Until I get instructions from one of the concern," vowed Captain Legay, "I shall do as I always have done, sir." "What is your position here, Mr. Hopper?" "I am manager, I calculate." The captain's fist was heard to come down on the desk. "You don't manage me," he said, "and I reckon you don't manage the colonel." Mr. Hopper's face was not pleasant to see as he emerged. But at sight of Judge Whipple on the steps his suavity returned. "The colonel will be in any minute, sir," said he. But the judge walked past him without reply and into the office. Captain Brent, seeing him, sprang to his feet. "Well, well, Judge," said he heartily, "you fellows have done it now, sure. I'll say this for you, you've picked a smart man." "Better vote for him, Legay," said the judge, setting down. The captain smiled at Stephen. "A man's got a lot of choice this year," said he. 2 governments, 33 governments, 1 government patched up for a year ox 2. Or no government, finished the judge. Legay, you're not such a fool as to vote against the Union? Judge, said the captain instantly, I'm not the only one in this town who will have to decide whether my sympathies are wrong. My sympathies are with the South. It's not a question of sympathy, Captain, answered the judge dryly. Abraham Lincoln himself was born in Kentucky. They had not heard a step without. Gentlemen, mark my words. If Abraham Lincoln is elected, the South leaves this Union. The judge started and looked up. The speaker was Colonel Carvel himself. Then, sir, Mr. Whipple cried hotly, then you will be chastised and brought back. For at last we have chosen a man who is strong enough, who does not fear your fire-eaters, whose electors depend on Northern votes alone. Stephen rose apprehensively, so did Captain Legay. The colonel had taken a step forward, and a fire was quick to kindle in his gray eyes. It was as quick to die. Judge Whipple, deathly pale, staggered and fell into Stephen's arms. But it was the colonel who laid him on the horsehair sofa. Silas, he said, Silas? Nor could the two who listened sound the depth of the pathos the colonel put into those two words. But the judge had not fainted. And the brusqueness in his weakened voice was even more pathetic. Tut, tut, said he. A little heat and no breakfast. The colonel already had a bottle of the famous Bourbon in his hand, and Captain Legay brought a glass of muddy iced water. Mr. Carvel made an injudicious mixture of the two, and held it to the lips of his friend. He was pushed away. Come, Silas, he said. No, cried the judge, and with this effort he slipped back again. Those who stood there thought that the stamp of death was already on Judge Whipple's face. But the lips were firmly closed, bidding defiance as ever to the world. The colonel, stroking his goatee, regarded him curiously. Silas, he said slowly, if you won't drink it for me, perhaps you will drink it for Abraham Lincoln. The two who watched that scene have never forgotten it. Outside, in the great cool store, the rattle of the trucks was heard, and Mr. Hopper giving commands. Within was silence. The straight figure of the colonel towered above the sofa while he waited. A full minute passed. Once Judge Whipple's bony hand opened and shut, and once his features worked. Then without warning he sat up. Colonel, said he, I reckon I wouldn't be much use to Abe if I took that. But if you'll send Ephraim after cup of coffee. Mr. Carvel set the glass down. In 2 strides he had reached the door and given the order. Then he came hack and seated himself on the sofa. Stephen found his mother at breakfast. He had forgotten the convention. He told her what had happened at Mr. Carvel's store, and how the colonel had tried to persuade Judge Whipple to take the Glencoe house while he was in Europe, and how the judge had refused. Tears were in the widow's eyes when Stephen finished. And he means to stay here in the heat and go through the campaign? She asked. He says that he will not stir. It will kill him, Stephen, Mrs. Brice faltered. So the colonel told him. And he said that he would die willingly, after Abraham Lincoln was elected. He had nothing to live for but to fight for that. He had never understood the world and had quarreled with it all his life. He said that to Colonel Carvel? Yes. Stephen. He didn't dare to look at his mother, nor she at him. And when he reached the office, half an hour later, Mr. Whipple was seated in his chair, defiant and unapproachable. Stephen sighed as he settled down to his work. The thought of one who might have accomplished what her father could not was in his head. She was at Monticello. Some 3 weeks later, Mr. Brincemaid's buggy drew up at Mrs. Brice's door. The Brincemaid family had been for some time in the country. And frequently, when that gentleman was detained in town by business, he would stop at the little home for tea. The secret of the good man's visit came out as he sat with them on the front steps afterward. I fear that it will be a hot summer, ma'am, he had said to Mrs. Brice. You should go to the country. The heat agrees with me remarkably, Mr. Brincemaid, said the lady, smiling. I have heard that Colonel Carvel wishes to rent his house at Glencoe, Mr. Brincemaid continued. The figure is not high. He mentioned it. And it was indeed nominal. It struck me that a change of air would do you good, Mrs. Brice and Stephen. Knowing that you shared in our uneasiness concerning Judge Whipple, I thought. He stopped and looked at her. It was a hard task even for that best and roost tactful of gentlemen, Mr. Brincemaid. He too had misjudged this calm woman. I understand you, Mr. Brincemaid, she said. She saw, as did Stephen, the kindness behind the offer, Colonel Carvel's kindness and his own. The gentleman's benevolent face brightened. And my dear madam, do not let the thought of this little house trouble you. It was never my expectation to have it occupied in the summer. If we could induce the judge to go to Glencoe with you for the summer, I am sure it would be a relief for us all. He did not press the matter, but begged Stephen to call on him in a day or two at the bank. "What do you think, Stephen?" asked his mother when Mr. Brinsmaid was gone. Stephen did not reply at once. What indeed could he say? The vision of that proud figure of Miss Virginia was before him, and he revolted. What was kindness from Colonel Carvel and Mr. Brinsmaid was charity from her. He could not bear the thought of living in a house haunted by her. And yet why should he let his pride and his feelings stand in the way of the health, perhaps of the life, of Judge Whipple? It was characteristic of his mother's strength of mind not to mention the subject again that evening. Stephen did not sleep in the hot night. But when he rose in the morning he had made up his mind. After breakfast he went straight to the Colonel's store and fortunately found Mr. Carvel at his desk, winding up his affairs. The next morning, when the train for the East pulled out of Illinois town, Miss Ginny Carvel stood on the platform tearfully waving goodbye to a knot of friends. She was leaving for Europe. Presently she went into the sleeping car to join the Colonel, who wore a gray liner's duster. For a long time she sat gazing at the young corn waving on the prairie, fingering the bunch of June roses on her lap. Clarence had picked them only a few hours ago in the dew at Bellegarde. She saw her cousin standing disconsolate under the train sheds, just as she had left him. She pictured him riding out the Bellefontaine Road that afternoon, alone. Now that the ocean was to be between them, was it love that she felt for Clarence at last? She glanced at her father. Once or twice she had suspected him of wishing to separate them. Her Aunt Lillian indeed had said as much, and Virginia had silenced her. But when she had asked the Colonel to take Clarence to Europe, he had refused. And yet she knew that he had begged Captain Legay to go. Virginia had been at home but a week. She had seen the change in Clarence and exulted. The very first day she had surprised him on the porch at Bellegarde with Hardy's tactics. From a boy Clarence had suddenly become a man with a purpose. And that was the purpose of the South. "They have dared to nominate that dirty Lincoln," he said. "Do you think that we will submit to nigger equality rule?" "Never. Never," he cried. "If they elect him, I will stand and fight them until my legs are shot from under me, and then I will shoot down the Yankees from the ground." Virginia's heart had leaped within her at the words, and into her eyes had flashed once more the look for which the boy had waited and hoped in vain. He had the carriage of a soldier, the animation and endurance of the thoroughbred when roused. He was of the stuff that made the resistance of the South the marvel of the world. And well we know, whatever the sound of it, that his speech was not heroics. Nor was it love for his cousin that inspired it, save in this: he had apatheticized Virginia. To him she was the inspired goddess of the South, his country. His admiration and affection had of late been laid upon an altar. Her ambition for him he felt was likewise the South's ambition for him. His mother, Virginia's aunt, felt this too, and strove against it with her feeble might. She never had had power over her son, nor over any man save the temporal power of beauty. And to her mortification she found herself actually in fear of this girl who might have been her daughter. So in Virginia's presence she became more trivial and petty than ever. It was her one defense. It had of course been a foregone conclusion that Clarence should join Company A. Few young men of family did not. And now he ran to his room to don for Virginia that glorious but useless full dress, the high bearskin rat, the red pigeon-tailed coat, the light blue trousers and the gorgeous, priceless shackle. Indeed the boy looked stunning. He held his big rifle like a veteran, and his face was set with a high resolve there was no mistaking. The high color of her pride was on the cheek of the girl as he brought his piece to the salute of her, his mistress. And yet, when he was gone and she sat alone amid the roses awaiting him, came willfully before her another face that was relentless determination, the face of Stephen Brice as he had stood before her in the summer house at Glencoe. Strive as she might against the thought, deny it to herself and others, to Virginia Carvel his way become the face of the North. Her patriotism and all that was in her of race rebelled. To conquer that face she would have given her own soul and Clarence's. Angrily she had arisen and paced the garden walks, and cried out aloud that it was not inflexible. And now, by the car window, looking out over the endless roll of the prairie, the memory of this was bitter within her. Suddenly she turned to her father. "Did you rent our house at Glencoe?" she asked. "No, Ginny. I suppose Mr. Brice was too proud to accept it at your charitable rent, even to save Mr. Whipple's life." The Colonel turned to his daughter in mild surprise. She was leaning back on the seat, her eyes half closed. "Once you dislike a person, Ginny, you never get over it. I always had a fancy for the young man, and now I have a better opinion of him than ever before. It was I who insulted them by naming that rent." "What did he do?" Virginia demanded. "He came to my office yesterday morning. 'Colonel Carvel,' said he, 'I hear you wish to rent your house.' I said yes. "You rented it once before, sir?" said he. "Yes," said I. "May I ask you what price you got for it?" said he. "And what did you say?" she asked, leaning forward. "I told him," said the colonel, smiling. "But I explained that I could not expect to command that price now on short notice." He replied that they would pay it or not consider the place. Virginia turned her head away and stared out over the fields. "How could they afford it?" she murmured. "Mr. Brice's maid tells me that young Brice won rather a remarkable case last winter, and since then has had some practice. And that he writes for the newspapers. I believe he declined some sort of an editorial position, preferring to remain at the law." "And so they are going into the house?" she asked presently. "No," said the colonel. "Whipple refused point blank to go to the country. He said that he would be shirking the only work of his life likely to be worth anything. So the Brices remain in town." Colonel Carvel sighed. But Virginia said nothing. Chapter 23. Richter's Scar. This was the summer when Mr. Stephen Brice began to make his appearance in public. The very first was rather encouraging than otherwise, although they were not all so. It was at a little town on the outskirts of the city where those who had come to scoff and jeer remained to listen. In writing that speech Stephen had striven to bear in mind a piece of advice which Mr. Lincoln had given him. "Speak so that the lowest may understand, and the rest will have no trouble." And it had worked. At the halting lameness of the beginning an egg was thrown, fortunately wide of the mark. After this incident Stephen fairly astonished his audience, especially an elderly gentleman who sat on a cracker box in the rear, out of sight of the stand. This may have been Judge Whipple, although we have no proof of the fact. Stephen himself would not have claimed originality for that speech. He laughs now when it is spoken of and calls it a boyish effort, which it was. I have no doubt that many of the master's phrases slipped in, as young Mr. Brice could repeat most of the debates and the Cooper Union speech by heart. He had caught more than the phrasing, however. So imbued was he with the spirit of Abraham Lincoln that his hearers caught it, and that was the end of the rotten eggs and the cabbages. The event is to be especially noted because they crowded around him afterward to ask questions. For one thing, he had not mentioned abolition. Wasn't it true then that this Lincoln wished to tear the Negro from his master, give him a vote and a subsidy, and set him up as the equal of the man that owned him? "Slavery may stay where it is," cried the young orator. "If it is content there, so are we content. What we say is that it shall not go one step farther. No, not 1 inch into a northern territory." On the next occasion Mr. Brice was one of the orators at a much larger meeting in a garden in South St. Louis. The audience was mostly German. And this was even a happier event, inasmuch as Mr. Brice was able to trace with some skill the history of the fatherland from the Napoleonic Wars to its revolution. Incidentally, he told them why they had emigrated to this great and free country. And when in an inspired moment he coupled the names of Abraham Lincoln and Father John, the very leaves of the trees above them trembled at their cheers. And afterwards there was a long-remembered supper in the moonlit grove with Richter and a party of his college friends from Jena. There was Herr Tiefel with the little Dresden blue eyes, red and round and jolly, and Hauptmann, long and thin and sallow, and Korner, red-bearded and ponderous, and Koenig, a little clean-cut man with a blonde mustache that pointed upward. They clattered their steins on the table and sang wonderful Jena songs, while Stephen was lifted up and his soul carried off to faraway Saxony, to the clean little university town with its towers and crooked streets. And when they sang the Trolks melody, Bemuster Bursch, ich, Ade, a big tear rolled down the scar on Richter's cheek. Fartwal Strassen grad in Krumm. Ich sie nicht mehr in Uk Hiram. Durchten Uk nicht mehr mit Gesang. Mit Larm nicht mehr in Sporenklang. As the deep tones died away, the soft night was steeped in the sadness of that farewell song. It was Richter who brought the full force of it home to Stephen. "Do you recall the day you left your Harvard and your Boston, my friend?" he asked. Stephen only nodded. He had never spoken of the bitterness of that even to his mother. And here was the difference between the Saxon and the Anglo-Saxon. Richter smoked his pipe, mid-dreamy silence, the tears still wet upon his face. "Tiefel and I were at the university together," he said at length. "He remembers the day I left Jena for good and all. Ah, Stephen, that is the most pathetic thing in life, next to leaving the fatherland. We dine with our student club for the last time at the Bergkeller, a dingy little tavern under a grim old house, but very dear to us. We swear for the last time to be clean and honorable and patriotic, and to die for the fatherland if God so wills. And then we march at the head of a slow procession out of the old West Gate, 2 and 2 old members first, then the Fox Major and the Foxes." "The Foxes?" Stephen interrupted. "The youngsters, the freshmen you call them, answered Richter, smiling. And after the foxes, said Herr Teufel, taking up the story, after the foxes comes the empty carriage with its gay postilion and four. It is like a long funeral, and every man is chanting that song. And so we go slowly until we come to the oil mill tavern, where we have had many a Schläger bout with the aristocrats. And the president of our society makes his farewell speech under the vines, and we drink to you with all the honors. And we drank to you, Carl, renowned swordsman. And Herr Teufel, carried away by the recollection, rose to his feet. The others caught fire and stood up with their mugs high in the air, shouting, Liebwall, Carl. Liebwall. Salamander, salamander, salamander. Eines die ein, zwei, zwei, dreis, drei. Liebwall. And so they toasted every man present, even Stephen himself, whom they complimented on his speech. And he soon learned to cry salamander, and to rub his mug on the table, German fashion. He was not long in discovering that Richter was not merely a prime favorite with his companions, but likewise a person of some political importance in South St. Louis. In the very midst of their merriment, an elderly man whom Stephen recognized as one of the German leaders, he afterwards became a United States general, came and stood smiling by the table and joined in the singing. But presently he carried Richter away with him. What a patriot he would have made had our country been spared to us, exclaimed Herr Koenig. I think he was the best man with the Schläger that Jena ever saw. Even Corner likes not to stand against him in mask and fencing hat, all padded. Rudolph? Herr Corner gave a good-natured growl of assent. I have still a welt that he gave me a month since, he said. He has left his mark on many an aristocrat. And why did you always fight the aristocrats? Stephen asked. They all tried to tell him at once, but Teufel prevailed. Because they were for making our country Austrian, my friend, he cried. Because they were overbearing and ground the poor. Because the most of them were immoral like the French, and we knew that it must be by morality and pure living that our Vaterland was to be rescued. And so we formed our guilds in opposition to theirs. We swore to live by the standards of the great John, of whom you spoke. We swore to strive for the freedom of Germany with manly courage. And when we were not dueling with the nobles, we had Schläger bouts among ourselves. Broadswords? Exclaimed Stephen in amazement. Jawohl, answered Corner, puffing heavily. The slit in his nose was plain even in the moonlight. To keep our hands in, as you would say. You Americans are a brave people without the Schläger. But we fought that we might not become effete. It was then that Stephen ventured to ask a question that had been long burning within him. See here, Mr. Corner, said he, how did Richter come by that scar? He always gets red when I mention it. He will never tell me. Ah, I can well believe that, answered Corner. I will recount that matter, if you do not tell Karl, lieber Freund. You would not forgive me. I was there in Berlin at the time. It was a famous time. Teufel will bear me out. Ja, ja, said Teufel eagerly. Mr. Brice, Herr Corner continued, has never heard of the Count von Kaulbach. No, of course. We at Jena had, and all Germany. Many of us of the Burschenschaft will bear to the grave the marks of his Schläger. Von Kaulbach went to Bonn, that university of the aristocrats, where he was worshipped. When he came to Berlin with his sister, crowds would gather to look at them. They were like Woden and Freya. Donner, exclaimed Herr Corner, there is something in blood when all is said. He was as straight and strong as an oak of the Black Forest, and she as fair as a poplar. It is so with the Pomeranians. It was in the year 47 when Karl Richter was gone home to Berlin before his last semester, to see his father. One fine morning von Kaulbach rode in at the Brandenburg Gate on a great black stallion. He boasted openly that day that none of the despised Burschenschaft dare stand before him. And Karl Richter took up the challenge. Before night all Berlin had heard of the temerity of the young liberal of the Jena Burschenschaft. To our shame be it said, we who knew and loved Karl likewise feared for him. Karl chose for his second Ibhart, a man of our own Germanian club at Jena, since killed in the Breitstrasse. And if you will believe me, my friend, I tell you that Richter came to the glade at daybreak smoking his pipe. The place was filled, the nobles on one side and the Burschenschaft on the other, and the sun coming up over the trees. Richter would not listen to any of us, not even the surgeon. He would not have the silk wound on his arm, nor the padded breeches, nor the neck covering, nothing. So Ibhart put on his gauntlets and peaked cap, and his apron with the device of the Germanians. There stood the Count in his white shirt in the pose of a statue. And when it was seen that Richter likewise had no protection, but was calmly smoking the little short pipe, with a charred bowl, a hush fell upon all. At the sight of the pipe von Kaulbach ground his heel in the turf, and when the word was given he rushed at Richter like a wild beast. You, my friend, who have never heard the whistle of sharp Schläger cannot know the song which a skilled arm draws from the blade. It was music that morning. You should have seen the noble's mighty strokes, prim und second und terz und quart. You would have marked how Richter met him at every blow. Von Kaulbach never once took his eyes from the blue smoke from the bowl. He was terrible in his fury, and I shiver now to think how we of the Burschenschaft trembled when we saw that our champion was driven back a step, and then another. You must know that it is a lasting disgrace to be forced over one's own line. It seemed as if we could not bear the agony. And then, while we counted out the last seconds of the half, came a snap like that of a whip's lash, and the bowl of Richter's pipe lay smoldering on the grass. The noble had cut the stem as clean as it were sapling twig, and there stood Richter with the piece still clenched in his teeth, his eyes ablaze and his cheek running blood. He pushed the surgeon away when he came forward with his needles. The count was smiling as he put up his sword, his friends crowding around him, when Ibhart cried out that his man could fight the second Menser, though the wound was 3 needles long. Then Kaulbach cried aloud that he would kill him. But he had not seen Karl's eyes. Something was in them that made us think as we washed the cut. But when we spoke to him he said nothing. Nor could we force the pipe stems from his teeth. Donner Schock, exclaimed Herr Corner but reverently, if I live to 100 I never hope to see such a sight as that Menser. The word was given. The Schläger flew so fast that we only saw the light and heard the ring alone. Before we of the Burschenschaft knew what had happened the Count von Kaulbach was over his line and had flung his Schläger into a great tree, and was striding from the place with his head hung and the tears streaming down his face. Amid a silence, Herr Corner lifted his great mug and emptied it slowly. A wind was rising, bearing with it song and laughter from distant groups, Teutonic song and laughter. The moonlight trembled through the shifting leaves. And Stephen was filled with a sense of the marvelous. It was as if this fierce duel, so full of national significance to a German, had been fought in another existence. It was incredible to him that the unassuming lawyer he knew, so wholly Americanized, had been the hero of it. Strange, indeed, that the striving life of these leaders of European revolution had been suddenly cut off in its vigor. There came to Stephen a flash of that world comprehension which marks great statesmen. Was it not with a divine purpose that this measureless force of patriotism and high ideal had been given to this youngest of the nations, that its high mission might be fulfilled? Miss Russell heard of Stephen's speeches. She and her brothers and Jack Brice made use to banter him when he came visiting in Bellefontaine Road. The time was not yet come when neighbor stared coldly upon neighbor, when friends of long standing passed each other with averted looks. It was not even a wild dream that white trash Lincoln would be elected. And so Mr. Jack, who made speeches for Breckinridge in the face of Mr. Brincemade's Union leanings, laughed at Stephen when he came to spend the night. He joined forces with Puss in making clever fun of the booby Dutch, which Stephen was wise enough to take good-naturedly. But once or twice when he met Clarence Colfax at these houses he was aware of a decided change in the attitude of that young gentleman. This troubled him more than he cared to admit. For he liked Clarence, who reminded him of Virginia, at once a pleasure and a pain. It is no harm to admit, for the benefit of the Society for Psychical Research, that Stephen still dreamed of her. He would go about his work absently all the morning with the dream still in his head, and the girl so vividly near him that he could not believe her to be traveling in England, as Miss Russell said. Puss and Anne were careful to keep him informed as to her whereabouts. Stephen set this down as a most natural supposition on their part that all young men must have an interest in Virginia Carvel. How needless to add that Virginia in her correspondence never mentioned Stephen, although Puss in her letters took pains to record the fact every time that he addressed a black Republican meeting. Miss Carvel paid no attention to this part of the communications. Her concern for Judge Whipple Virginia did not hide, and wrote of him. How he stood the rigors of that campaign were a mystery to friend and foe alike. Chapter 24. How a Prince Came. Who has not heard of the St. Louis Agricultural Fair? And what memories of its October days the mere mention of it brings back to us who knew that hallowed place as children. There was the vast wooden amphitheater where mad trotting races were run, where stolid cattle walked past the Chinese pagoda in the middle circle, and shook the blue ribbons on their horns. But it was underneath the tiers of seats, the whole way around the ring, that the chief attractions lay hid. These were the church booths, where fried oysters and sandwiches and cake and wit candy and ice cream were sold by your mothers and sister for charity. These ladies wore white aprons as they waited on the burly farmers. And toward the close of the day for which they had volunteered they became distracted. Christ Church had a booth and St. George's, and Dr. Thayer's Unitarian where Mrs. Brice might be found and Mr. DeWitt's, conducted by Mr. Eliphalet Hopper on strictly business principles, and the Roman Catholic Cathedral, where Miss Renaud and other young ladies of French descent presided, and Dr. Postlethwaite's Presbyterian, which we shall come to presently, and others the whole way around the ring. There is one fair which old St. Louisans still delight to recall, that of the autumn of 1860. Think for a minute. You will remember that Virginia Carvel came back from Europe, and made quite a stir in a town where all who were worth knowing were intimates. Stephen caught a glimpse of her in the street, received a distant bow, and dreamed of her that night. Mr. Eliphalet Hopper, in his Sunday suit, was at the ferry to pay his respects to the colonel, to offer his services, and to tell him how the business fared. His was the first St. Louis face that Virginia saw, Captain Legay being in New Orleans, and if she conversed with Eliphalet on the ferry with more warmth than ever before, there is nothing strange in that. Mr. Hopper rode home with them in the carriage, and walked to Miss Crane's with his heart thumping against his breast, and wild thoughts whirling in his head. The next morning in Virginia's sunny front room tears and laughter mingled. There was a present for Eugenie and Anne and Emily and Puss and Maud, and a here kiss from the colonel for each. And more tears and laughter and sighs as Mammy Easter and Rosetta unpacked the English trunks, and with trembling hands and rolling eyes laid each Parisian gown upon the bed. But the fair, the fair. At the thought of that glorious year my pen fails me. Why mention the dread possibility of the Negro worshipper Lincoln being elected the very next month? Why listen to the rumblings in the South? Pompey had chariot races to the mutterings of Vesuvius. St. Louis was in gala garb to greet a prince. That was the year that Miss Virginia Carvel was given charge of the booth in Dr. Postlethwaite's church. The booth next one of the great arches through which prancing horses and lowing cattle came. Now who do you think stopped at the booth for a chat with Miss Ginny? Who made her blush as pink as her Paris gown? Who slipped into her hand the contribution for the church, and refused to take the cream candy she laughingly offered him as an equivalent? None other than Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, Duke of Saxony, Duke of Cornwall and Rothesay, Earl of Chester and Carrick, Baron Renfrew, and Lord of the Isles. Out of compliment to the Republic which he visited, he bore the simple title of Lord Renfrew. Bitter tears of envy, so it was said, were shed in the other booths. Belle Clume made a remark which is best suppressed. Eliphalet Hopper, in Mr. DeWitt's booths, stared until his eyes watered. A great throng peered into the covered way, kept clear for His Royal Highness and suite, and for the prominent gentlemen who accompanied them. And when the prince was seen to turn to his Grace, the Duke of Newcastle, and the subscription was forthcoming, a great cheer shook the building, while Virginia and the young ladies with her bowed and blushed and smiled. Colonel Carvel, who was a director, laid his hand paternally on the blue coat of the young prince. Reversing all precedent, he presented His Royal Highness to his daughter and to the other young ladies. It was done with the easy grace of a southern gentleman. Whereupon Lord Renfrew bowed and smiled too, and stroked his mustache, which was a habit he had, and so fell naturally into the ways of democracy. Miss Puss Russell, who has another name and whose hair is now white, will tell you how Virginia carried off the occasion with credit to her country. It is safe to say that the prince forgot Silver Heels and Royal Oak, although they had been trotted past the pagoda only that morning for his delectation. He had forgotten His Honor the Mayor, who had held fast to the young man's arm as the 4 coal-black horses had pranced through the crowds all the way from Barnum's Hotel to the fair grounds. His Royal Highness forgot himself still further, and had at length withdrawn his hands from the pockets of his ample pantaloons and thrust his thumbs into his yellow waistcoat. And who shall blame him if Miss Virginia's replies to his sallies enchained him? Not the least impressive of those who stood by, smiling, was the figure of the tall colonel, his hat off for once and pride written on his face. Oh, that his dear wife might have lived to see this! What was said in that historic interview with the future sovereign of England, far from his royal palaces, on democratic sawdust, with an American beauty across a board counter, was immediately recorded by the colonel, together with an exact description of His Royal Highness's blue coat and light, flowing pantaloons, and yellow waistcoat and colored kids. Even the prince's habit of stroking his mustache did not escape the watchful eye. It is said that His Grace of Newcastle smiled twice at Miss Virginia's retorts, and Lord Lyons, the British minister, has more than 2 to his credit. But suddenly a strange thing happened. Miss Virginia in the very midst of a sentence paused and then stopped. Her eyes had strayed from the royal countenance, and were fixed upon a point in the row of heads outside the promenade. Her sentence was completed, with some confusion. Perhaps it is no wonder that my Lord Renfrew, whose intuitions are quick, remarked that he had already remained too long, thus depriving the booth of the custom it otherwise should have had. This was a graceful speech and a kingly Followed by his retinue and the prominent citizens, he moved on. And it was remarked by keen observers that His Honor the Mayor had taken hold once more of the prince's elbow, who divided his talk with Colonel Carver. Dear Colonel Carvel, what a true American of the old type you were. You, nor the mayor, nor the rest of the grave and elderly gentlemen were not blinded by the light of a royal presence. You saw in him only an amiable and lovable young man, who was to succeed the most virtuous and lovable of sovereigns, Victoria. You, Colonel Carvel, were not one to cringe to royalty. Out of respect for the just and lenient sovereign, his mother, you did honor to the prince. But you did not remind him, as you might have, that your ancestors fought for the king at Marston Moor, and that your grandfather was once an intimate of Charles James Fox. But what shall we say of Mr. Clume, and of a few others whose wealth alone enabled them to be directors of the fair? Miss Isabel Clume was duly presented, in proper form, to His Royal Highness. Her father owned a peerage, and had been abroad likewise. He made no such bull as the colonel. And while the celebrated conversation of which we have spoken was in progress, Mr. Clume stood back and blushed for his countrymen, and smiled apologetically at the few gentlemen of the royal suite who glanced his way. His Royal Highness then proceeded to luncheon, which is described by a most amiable Canadian correspondent who sent to his newspaper an account of it that I cannot forbear to copy. You may believe what he says or not, just as you choose. So interested was His Royal Highness in the proceedings that he stayed in the ring 3.5 hours witnessing these trotting matches. He was invited to take lunch in a little wooden shanty prepared for the directors, to which he accordingly repaired, but whether he got anything to eat or not, I cannot tell. After much trouble he forced his way to the table, which he found surrounded by a lot of ravenous animals. And upon some half-dozen huge dishes were piled slices of beef, mutton, and buffalo tongue. Beside them were great jugs of lager beer, rolls of bread, and plates of a sort of cabbage cut into thin shreds, raw and mixed with vinegar. There were neither salt spoons nor mustard spoons. The knives the gentlemen were eating with serving in their stead, and by the aid of nature's forks, the slices of beef and mutton were transferred to the plates of those who desired to eat. While your correspondent stood looking at the spectacle, the Duke of Newcastle came in and he sat looking too. He was evidently trying to look democratic but could not manage it. By his side stood a man urging him to try the lager beer and cabbage also, I suppose. Henceforth, let the New York alderman who gave to the Turkish ambassador ham sandwiches and bad sherry rest in peace. Even that great man whose memory we love and revere, Charles Dickens, was not overkind to us, and saw our faults rather than our virtues. We were a nation of grasshoppers and spat tobacco from early morning until late at night. This some of us undoubtedly did, to our shame be it said. And when Mr. Dickens went down the Ohio early in the 40s, he complained of the men and women he met, who, bent with care, bolted through silent meals and retired within their cabins. Mr. Dickens saw our ancestors bowed in a task that had been too great for other blood. The task of bringing into civilization in the compass of a century a wilderness 3,000 miles at breadth. And when His Royal Highness came to St. Louis and beheld 100,000 people at the fair, we are sure that he knew how recently the ground he stood upon had been conquered from the forest. A strange thing had happened indeed. For while the prince lingered in front of the booth of Dr. Postlethwaite's church and chatted with Virginia, a crowd had gathered without. They stood peering over the barricade into the covered way, proud of the self-possession of their young countrywoman. And here, by a twist of fate, Mr. Stephen Brice found himself perched on a barrel beside his friend Richter. It was Richter who discovered her first. Himmel! It is Miss Carvel herself, Stephen? He cried, impatient at the impassive face of his companion. Look, Stephen, look there. Yes, said Stephen, I see. Eisich, exclaimed the disgusted German, will nothing move you? I have seen German princesses that are peasant women beside her. How she carries it off. See, the prince is laughing. Stephen saw, and horror held him in a tremor. His one thought was of escape. What if she should raise her eyes, and amid those vulgar stares discern his own? And yet that was within him which told him that she would look up. It was only a question of moments, and then she would in truth despise him. Wedged tightly between the people, to move was to be betrayed. He groaned. Suddenly he rallied, ashamed of his own false shame. This was because of one whom he had known for the short space of a day, whom he was to remember for a lifetime. The man he worshipped and she detested. Abraham Lincoln would not have blushed between honest clerks and farmers. Why should Stephen Brice? And what, after all, was this girl to him? He could not tell. Almost the first day he had come to St. Louis the wires of their lives had crossed, and since then had crossed many times again, always with a spark. By the might of generations she was one thing and he another. They were separated by a vast and ever-widening breach only to be closed by the blood and bodies of 1,000,000 of their countrymen. And yet he dreamed of her. Gradually, charmed like the simple people about him, Stephen became lost in the fascination of the scene. Suddenly confronted at a booth in a public fair with the heir to the English throne, who but one of her own kind might have carried it off so well, have been so complete a mistress of herself? Since, save for a heightened color, Virginia gave no sign of excitement. Undismayed, forgetful of the admiring crowd, unconscious of their stares until the very strength of his gaze had compelled her own. Such had been the prophecy within him. Nor did he wonder because in that multitude of faces, her eyes had flown so straightly homeward to his. With a rough effort that made an angry stir, Stephen flung the people aside and escaped, the astonished Richter following in his wake. Nor could the honest German dissuade him from going back to the office for the rest of the day, or discover what had happened. But all through the afternoon that scene was painted on the pages of Stephen's books. The crude booth in the darkened way. The free pose of the girl standing in front of her companions, a blue wisp of autumn sunlight falling at her feet. The young prince laughing at her sallies, and the elderly gentleman smiling with benevolence upon the pair. Chapter 25. Into which a potentate comes. Virginia danced with the prince, by special appointment, at the ball that evening. So did her aunt, Mrs. Addison Colfax. So likewise was Miss Belle Clume among those honored and approved. But Virginia wore the most beautiful of her Paris gowns, and seemed a princess to one watching from the gallery. Stephen was sure that His Royal Highness made that particular dance longer than the others. It was decidedly longer than the one he had with Miss Clume, although that young lady had declared she was in heaven. Alas, that princess cannot abide with us forever. His Royal Highness bade farewell to St. Louis, and presently that same city of Alton, which bore him northward, came back again in like royal state, and this time it was in honor of a Democrat potentate. He is an old friend now, senator and judge and presidential candidate, Stephen Arnold Douglas, father of the doctrine of local sovereignty which he has come to preach. So goes the world. We are no sooner rid of one hero than we are ready for another. Blow, you bandsmen on the hurricane deck, let the shores echo with your national airs. Let the gay bunting wave in the river breeze. Uniforms flash upon the guards, for no campaign is complete without the military. Here are brave companies of the Douglas Guards, the Hickory Sprouts, and the Little Giants to do honor to the person of their hero. Cannon are booming as he steps into his open carriage that evening on the levee, where the piles of river freight are covered with people. Transparencies are dodging in the darkness. A fresh band strikes up Hail Columbia, and the 4 horses prance away, followed closely by the independent Broom Rangers. The shouts for Douglas, remarked a keen observer who was present, must have penetrated Abraham's bosom at Springfield. Mr. Jacob Clume, who had been a Bell and Everett man until that day, was not the only person of prominence converted. After the speech he assured the judge that he was now undergoing the greatest pleasure of his life in meeting the popular orator, the true representative man of the Great West, the matured statesman, and the able advocate of national principles. And although Mr. Douglas looked as if he had heard something of the kind before, he pressed Mr. Clume's hand warmly. So was the author of Popular Sovereignty, the great bulwark of American independence, escorted to the courthouse steps, past houses of his stanch supporters, which were illuminated in his honor. Stephen, wedged among the people, remarked that the judge had lost none of his self-confidence since that day at Freeport. Who, seeing the Democratic candidate smiling and bowing to the audience that blocked the wide square, would guess that the question troubled him at all, or that he missed the votes of the solid South. How gravely the judge listened to the eulogy of the prominent citizen, who reminded him that his work was not yet finished, and that he still was harnessed to the cause of the people. And how happy was the choice of that word harnessed. The judge had heard, so he said, with deep emotion the remarks of the chairman. Then followed one of those masterful speeches which wove a spell about those who listened, which, like the most popular of novels, moved to laughter and to tears, to anger and to pity. Mr. Brice and Mr. Richter were not the only black Republicans who were depressed that night. And they trudged homeward with the wild enthusiasm still ringing in their ears, heavy with the thought that the long hot campaign of their own wide-awakes might be in vain. They had a grim reproof from Judge Whipple in the morning. "So you two gentlemen took opium last night?" was all he said. The dreaded possibility of Mr. Lincoln's election did not interfere with the gaieties. The week after the fair Mr. Clarence Colfax gave a great dance at Bellegarde, in honor of his cousin Virginia, to which Mr. Stephen Brice was not invited. A majority of Company A was there. Virginia would have liked to have had them in uniform. It was at this time that Brice's maid took the notion of having a ball in costume. Virginia, on hearing the news, rode over from Bellegarde, and flinging her reins to Nicodemus ran up to Anne's little dressing room. "Whom have you invited, Anne?" she demanded. And ran over the long list of their acquaintance, but there was one name she omitted. "Are you sure that that is all?" asked Virginia searchingly when she had finished, and looked mystified. "I have invited Stephen Brice, Ginny," she said. But, cried Virginia. "I knew it. Am I to be confronted with that Yankee everywhere I go? It is always Stephen Brice, and he is ushered in with a but," and was quite overcome by this outburst. She had dignity, however, and plenty of it. And she was a loyal friend. "You have no right to criticize my guests, Virginia." Virginia, seated on the arm of a chair, tapped her foot on the floor. "Why couldn't things remain as they were?" she said. "We were so happy before these Yankees came. And they are not content in trying to deprive us of our rights. They must spoil our pleasure too." "Stephen Brice is a gentleman," answered Anne. "He spoils no one's pleasure and goes no place that he is not asked." "He has not behaved according to my idea of a gentleman, the few times that I have been unfortunate enough to encounter him," Virginia retorted. "You are the only one who says so, then." Here the feminine got the better of Anne's prudence, and she added, "I saw you waltz with him once, Ginny Carvel, and I am sure you never enjoyed a dance as much in your life." Virginia blushed purple. "And Brice's maid," she cried. "You may have your ball and your Yankees, all of them you want. But I shan't come. How I wish I had never seen that horrid Stephen Brice. Then you would never have insulted me." Virginia rose and snatched her riding whip. This was too much for Anne. She threw her arms around her friend without more ado. "Don't quarrel with me, Ginny," she said tearfully. "I couldn't bear it. Mr. Brice is not coming, I am sure." Virginia disengaged herself. "He is not coming?" "No," said Anne. "You asked me if he was invited. And I was going on to tell you that he could not come." She stopped and stared at Virginia in bewilderment. That young lady, instead of beaming, had turned her back. She stood flicking her whip at the window, gazing out over the trees, down the slope to the river. Miss Russell might have interpreted these things. Simple and... "Why isn't he coming?" said Virginia at last. "Because he is to be one of the speakers at a big meeting that night. Have you seen him since you got home, Ginny? He is thinner than he was. We are much worried about him because he has worked so hard this summer." "A Black Republican meeting?" exclaimed Virginia, scornfully ignoring the rest of what was said. "Then I'll come, Anne dear," she cried, tripping the length of the room. "I'll come as Titania. Who will you be?" She cantered off down the drive and out of the gate, leaving a very puzzled young woman watching her from the window. But when Virginia reached the forest at the bend of the road, she pulled her horse down to a walk. She bethought herself of the gown which her Uncle Daniel had sent her from Calvert House, and of the pearls. And she determined to go as her great-grandmother, Dorothy Carvel. Shades of romance. How many readers will smile before the rest of this true incident is told? What had happened was this. Miss Brice's maid had driven to town in her mother's Jenny Lind a day or two before, and had stopped, as she often did, to pay a call on Mrs. Brice. This lady, as may be guessed, was not given to discussion of her husband's ancestors, nor of her own. But on the walls of the little dining room hung a Copley and two Stuarts. One of the Stuarts was a full length of an officer in the buff and blue of the Continental Army. And it was this picture which caught Anne's eye that day. "How like Stephen," she exclaimed, and added, "Only the face is much older." "Who is it, Mrs. Brice?" "Colonel Wilton Brice, Stephen's grandfather. There is a marked look about all the Brices. He was only 20 years of age when the Revolution began. That picture was painted much later in life, after Stuart came back to America, when the colonel was nearly 40. He had kept his uniform, and his wife persuaded him to be painted in it. If Stephen would only come as Colonel Wilton Brice," she cried. "Do you think he would, Mrs. Brice?" Mrs. Brice laughed and shook her head. "I am afraid not, Anne," she said. "I have a part of the uniform upstairs, but I could never induce him even to try it on." As she drove from shop to shop that day, and reflected that it certainly would not be like Stephen to wear his grandfather's uniform to a ball. But she meant to ask him at any rate. And she had driven home immediately to write her invitations. It was with keen disappointment that she read his note of regret. However, on the very day of the ball, and chanced to be in town again, and caught sight of Stephen pushing his way among the people on 4th Street. She waved her hand to him and called to Nicodemus to pull up at the sidewalk. "We are all so sorry that you are not coming," said she impulsively. And there she stopped short. 4 and was a sincere person and remembered Virginia. That is, I am so sorry, she added a little hastily. Stephen, I saw the portrait of your grandfather, and I wanted you to come in his costume. Stephen, smiling down on her, said nothing. Anne, poor Anne, in her fear that he had perceived the shade in her meaning, made another unfortunate remark. If you were not a Republican, she said. A black Republican, he answered and laughed at her discomfiture. What then? And was very red. I only meant that if you were not a Republican, there would be no meeting to address that night. It does not make any difference to you what my politics are, does it? He asked a little earnestly. Oh, Stephen, she exclaimed in gentle reproof. Some people have discarded me, he said, striving to smile. She wondered whether he meant Virginia and whether he cared. Still further embarrassed, she said something which she regretted immediately. Couldn't you contrive to come? He considered. I will come after the meeting if it is not too late, he said at length. But you must not tell anyone. He lifted his hat and hurried on, leaving Anne in a quandary. She wanted him. But what was she to say to Virginia? Virginia was coming on the condition that he was not to be there. Anne was scrupulous. Stephen, too, was almost instantly sorry that he had promised. The little costumer's shop, the only one in the city at that time, had been ransacked for the occasion, and nothing was left to fit him. But when he reached home there was a strong smell of camphor in his mother's room. Colonel Brice's cocked hat and sword and spurs lay on the bed, and presently Hester brought in the blue coat and buff waistcoat from the kitchen, where she had been pressing them. Stephen must needs yield to his mother's persuasions and try them on. They were more than a passable fit. But there were the breeches and cavalry boots to be thought of, and the ruffled shirt and the powdered wig. So before tea he hurried down to the costumer's again, not quite sure that he was not making a fool of himself, and yet at last sufficiently entered into the spirit of the thing. The coat was mended and freshened. And when after tea he dressed in the character, his appearance was so striking that his mother could not refrain from some little admiration. As for Hester, she was in transports. Stephen was human and young. But still the frivolity of it all troubled him. He had inherited from Colonel Wilton Brice, the Puritan, other things beside clothes. And he felt in his heart as he walked soberly to the hall that this was no time for fancy dress balls. All intention of going was banished by the time his turn had come to speak. But mark how certain matters are beyond us. Not caring to sit out the meeting on the platform, he made his way down the side of the crowded hall, and ran into, of all people, Big Tom Catherwood. As the Southern rights politics of the Catherwood family were a matter of note in the city, Stephen did not attempt to conceal his astonishment. Tom himself was visibly embarrassed. He congratulated Stephen on his speech, and volunteered the news that he had come in a spirit of fairness to hear what the intelligent leaders of the Republican Party, such as Judge Whipple, had to say. After that he fidgeted. But the sight of him started in Stephen a train of thought that closed his ears for once to the judge's words. He had had before a huge liking for Tom. Now he admired him, for it was no light courage that took one of his position there. And Stephen remembered that Tom was not risking merely the displeasure of his family and his friends, but likewise something of greater value than either. From childhood Tom had been the devoted slave of Virginia Carvel, with as little chance of marrying her as a man ever had. And now he was endangering even that little alliance. And so Stephen began to think of Virginia, and to wonder what she would wear at Anne's party, and to speculate how she would have treated him if had gone. To speak truth, this last matter had no little weight in his decision to stay away. But we had best leave motives to those whose business and equipment it is to weigh to a grain. Since that agonizing moment when her eyes had met his own among the curiously vulgar at the fair, Stephen's fear of meeting Virginia had grown to the proportions of a terror. And yet there she was in his mind, to take possession of it on the slightest occasion. When Judge Whipple had finished, Tom rose. He awoke Mr. Brice from a trance. "Stephen," said he, "of course you're going to the Brincemaids." Stephen shook his head. "Why not?" said Tom in surprise. "Haven't you a costume?" "Yes," he answered dubiously. "Why then you've got to come with me," says Tom heartily. "It isn't too late and they'll want you. I've a buggy and I'm going to the Russells to change my clothes. Come along." Stephen went. And that concludes this book of adventure. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this audiobook with fellow fantasy lovers, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the Vox Lore and ring the bell so you never miss a new tale. Until next time, keep your imagination wild and your stories legendary. See you in the next adventure. Asterisk.